Assalamu alaikum. Today we'll continue with yesterday's topic on Matthew Arnold, and we'll look into some of his other concepts and his practical criticism that he became famous for, which is quite possibly a more enduring form of criticism of Arnold's. Okay, so we've seen in introduction the age of Queen Victoria and the various movements that were seen that had a major impact in the literature of the time, the various literary figures of his time, and some of his key critical works, and the kind of social criticism that Arnold is known for, and the function of poetry as far as Arnold is concerned, and his theory of touchstone, wherein he suggests that anyone who is invested in doing any kind of proper criticism of literary works should be capable of assessing or gauging a literary work based on some previous experience especially experienced in the works of the masters, the major works of masters. So for him, Dante, Milton, Shakespeare are the according to Arnold, are the masters, and their works, especially some major passages, in all there were 11 passages that he felt the need for anyone indulging in criticism to analyze and to remember, so that and absorb, so that when you come across a new work, you would be capable of judging it in all fairness. Of course, high seriousness was one of the reasons, one of the important or key ingredients he felt was necessary for poetry, because gone were the days when you can afford to be frivolous, but now you need to be serious. Because the times are such that you need to learn to fight for basic living. You cannot live in your dream world anymore. So he felt the certain high seriousness ought to be accorded to literature, and especially poetry, because it has high destinies. Now this is where we stopped, I believe. He makes use of this word disinterestedness, not in the way we call disinterest. Disinterest for us is something we are not interested in. Here Arnold makes use of this word in the sense that you do not show any partiality, that you are not biased or prejudiced. A certain disinterest is necessary, as I spoke of in my earlier class about the two kinds of fallacies one should avoid, right? The historic fallacy and the personal fallacy. Remember, the two fallacies you should avoid when you try to judge or criticize a work, right? So disinterestedness goes along those same lines. Arnold believed that the critic should employ disinterestedness when judging poetry. The critic's social function is to present an unbiased assessment of a text, disinterested, not swayed by any practice or politics, personal or otherwise. See, a writer, especially, say for instance in Shakespeare himself, when you take him, I mean, he is a great writer, of course, there is no contesting the fact, but when he wrote with the view of pleasing the queen. He wanted to cater to the needs of the courtly people, the people of the court, right? He wanted to cater to the masses, so he had these audiences in mind when he wrote anything. Again, the same thing happens when Milton wrote. He wanted to cater to his king, right? And of course, the protectorate, right? His king here would mean the protectorate. He was against the divine rights of king, right? His work is extremely political in nature. No matter what work you take up, whether it is Areopagitica or whether you take Paradise Lost or Regained, whatever work Milton wrote is highly political in nature. Again, when you go for any other writing, for instance, works of Tennyson for that matter, they are politically charged to a large extent. Again, they had to cater to the needs of the public. At the same time, they had to please the crown, right? They had to look up to the parliament before they put their pen to writing. So you see, Arnold felt that it is necessary, extremely necessary, it's imperative that one should look into one's conscience rather than the parliament or the politician before you start writing anything. All right, so this kind of disinterestedness he believed was necessary. Okay, again, moving on. Where was I? Yeah. The function of criticism, according to what Matthew Arnold wrote this one essay on function of criticism, in which he feels that Saint Beuve's ideology, voicing Saint Beuve's ideology, he says a disinterested endeavor to learn the function. Actually, function of the main function of criticism, according to Matthew Arnold, is a disinterested endeavor to learn and propagate the best that is known and thought in the world. So what is the function of criticism? Why do you need to criticize a certain work? Because you need to guide, you need to show people that so and so work is worth reading, so and so work is going to benefit you some way. That's the main function of criticism. Because see, you can just, I mean, there are so many critical writing, there are so many critical work, but how many of us are actually looking up to them before we enter a library, or before we make a choice for reading anything? How many of us actually look into anything, look into any kind of criticism? See, it is necessary for a critic to be the judge, okay, be the judge of what is good and bad, so that he can show the way to the masses what is worth reading and what is trash. All right, it is a function of a critic. It is the job of a critic to show the way, to lead the way, and it should be what kind of endeavor? It should be a disinterested endeavor, as in it should not be influenced by any kind of politics. All right, it should be completely unbiased, unprejudiced endeavor to learn and propagate the best that is known and thought in the world. Its purpose is for literature to flourish through influencing the creative and critical minds for the flowering of great literature. So you see, a critic is supposed to, I've already, I believe in some 2 or 3 classes ago, I've already spoken of aeons as in how a certain aeon is created, how a certain age is created, right? There are aeons as in there is a critical age, and then there is a creative age. When the creativity falls down, when the when the creative minds are lagging, or they are just going a monotonous way, it is necessary for the critics to take up their pens and lead the way, and show the way, guide the way as to what to write, what kind of creative work is expected of the creative minds of the time. Okay, so this is one of the ideas propagated by Matthew Arnold. He believed that every creative age is followed by a critical age, and this critical age guides the creative minds of the time to create well, write well. Otherwise, what happens? You tend to end up with substandard works that are not fit for reading, that are of no benefit to the society, is of no use to anyone. All right, and they are frivolous, they are ribald, they are absolutely unnecessary. In fact, they tend to create evil, all right, create vices in the society rather than bring in any kind of progress. They tend to bring in some sort of degeneration in society. All right, so the criticism, according to Matthew Arnold, is extremely important, and the role of a critic is such that he is in charge of leading the way, guiding the people, the masses, as to what kind of books to read, what is the best, what is best taught, to learn and propagate the best that is known and thought in the world. Okay, and also to guide the creators, to let the creators know what kind of work is expected of them. That's what the function of criticism is, to to see the object as in itself it really is the main function of criticism. To see as it is, to see things as they are, okay, without being influenced otherwise. Now, as far as Arnold's view of romantics is concerned, he he made extremely disparaging comments on the romantic poets. He calls Byron empty of matter. Of course, we revere, sort of almost revere the romantics because of the kind of poetry, exemplary poetry created in during that time. But then we do have to agree that it was extremely selfish, right? It was extremely selfish. Of course, I would exclude Shelley in that case, and because he did think of other people besides himself. But then it was extremely, extremely self-centered. It went deep into one's own psychology. Of course, you get to connect with Wordsworth, you get to connect with Coleridge on every topic they chose to write on. But then, of course, they were extremely, how should I say, they sort of were known for mainly their flowery language, and this flowery language had no place in the Victorian society as far as Arnold is concerned. So he thought Byron was empty of matter. He didn't have anything to say. Of course, when you look at there are parts in Don Juan where you find Byron making such derogatory comments about the politics of the British politics. Of course, Byron himself is considered a Greek hero because he was a soldier. He fought for another country. He was not well received in England itself. Of course, he did have certain friends. He had a large fan following, but this fan following extended not to his person as such, right? In fact, there were times when Byron's work was banned in England itself, because a certain amount of vulgarity had crept into his writing, right? So you see, Matthew Arnold, who is so strict and straightforward, he abhorred Byron's writing. So he thought Byron was empty of matter, Shelley incoherent, beautiful and ineffectual angel beating in the void of his luminous wings in vain. As if he is an angel. He is a beautiful and ineffectual angel beating in the void his luminous wings in vain. His wings were showy, but he is beating it in the void. It's vain, okay? It's useless. So he calls Shelley incoherent. Well, I refuse to agree with Arnold in this case, but I don't know. It's a matter of perception, because I find Shelley quite deeply philosophical. At the same time, he has a great empathy for his fellow countrymen. Letters of Keats. Well, even though see, he is mainly concerned here. Arnold is mainly concerned here with not with the literary works of these poets, but some of the criticism of these poets. Letters of Keats are love letters, according to Matthew Arnold. Love letters of a surgeon's apprentice. Surgeon's apprentice, of course, we all know the history of Keats, how he was an apprentice and how he had a very short life. At the same time, whatever criticism he made is found only in his writings, in his letters to his brothers and his friends, right? And of course, they are sort of abstract. The idea of negative capability, though interesting enough, does not find validity in practical criticism. Then Coleridge, a poet and philosopher, wrecked in the midst of opium. So Coleridge, of course, he is a poet and a philosopher of great strength, but his strength was wrecked in the midst of opiumism. He became addicted to opium, and his genius was lost in it. So this was Arnold's criticism of romanticism. As far as the subject of poetry is concerned, Arnold believed that tragedy is the most appropriate subject for poetry. He follows the classics to some extent in this case. right? His dramatic poem Empedocles of Etna, where a Greek philosopher disillusioned with life throws himself into the crater of Etna, provides a tragic element necessary for sublime thought. So this Empedocles of Etna is his one dramatic poem, which became famous mainly for the criticism it met with rather than its subject matter. Okay, so it mainly deals with a philosopher, the Greek philosopher, who was disillusioned with life, who and committed suicide by jumping off from Mount Etna. Now, this intensity with which this philosopher feels provides the necessary, the necessary emotion for the dramatic element to be carried forward. Okay, but then this has to culminate somewhere. This emotion has to have a consequent action. Otherwise, this intense emotion is of no use. So he has to throw himself from the mountain at some point. So that brings in the necessary culmination to the intensity of the emotions produced during the play. So poetry where suffering finds no vent in action, unrelieved and unresolvable, he considers bad poetry. So any poetry that just goes on feeling intensely without any, without its culmination in a certain action, he feels it's a bad poetry. It's not a good enough poetry. As dull subject cannot be made interesting, he vies for excellent action, appealing to the great primary human affection. So he felt that any poetry, for that matter, if it had a dull subject, of course it cannot be interesting enough. Again, there are writers who will contest this point, who can prove to you no matter how dull a subject, if treated well, it could be made interesting. But then yes, so this is Matthew Arnold we're talking about, so he felt that way. So it was necessary that the great primary human affection had to be appealing. Greek poetry, he claims, should be the model for English poets. As I said earlier, he followed the classics to a large degree in assuming that tragedy was the best subject for writing poetry. Judicial criticism. See, he was extremely he was extremely forward in thought, as in social reforms are concerned. But then you also have to remember that he was against science to some extent. Science isn't, to him, was the demon that robbed the cradle away. Okay, it robbed the man of his faith and religion. So he pleads for us to return to the study of humanities against sciences. Okay, now attacking middle class Philistinism, he called for the improvement of criticism, and his Philistinism isn't like the middle class. They were getting educated, but at the same time they were turning towards extremely money minded. And hence materialistic. And this Philistinism he abhorred, and he wanted to improve criticism, and he wanted to improve the standards of people in the way that not merely that they not merely become rich as in monetary rich, but also superior in terms of morality. He asks for freedom from British provincialism and acceptance of European ideologies. So he wants us to stop being narrow-minded and accept and learn to accept ideologies propagated in Europe. As we mentioned, this is seen in the aftermath of the French Revolution. There is much to be admired in the efforts taken by Matthew Arnold. Now, speaking of real estimate, to have the real estimate rather than subjectivism and antiquarism, Arnold says, should be the aim of a critic. So here, real estimate goes against the two fallacies I already spoke of, that is the historic fallacy and the personal fallacy. So historic estimate is not permitted according to Arnold, neither is personal estimate. A real estimate ought to be achieved. Real estimate is possible only when you become objective rather than subjective. Subjectivism is becoming personal. Antiquarianism is, having a great liking for something that is historical. Historical isn't, see, whenever we think of something that is quaint and really old fashioned, we sort of assume that it is bound to be classic, it's bound to be really good, whereas that's not the case all the time, right? Things may be old, things may be historically superior age wise, chronologically, but then they may not be all that good either. So you see, you have to remove this perception, this understanding that being, just personally liking something, or just because something is really old, cannot be a yardstick with which to judge a book. Absolutism, dogmatism, either personal or historical, will hinder any real estimate of a poem. Absolutism isn't having any absolute universal truth. See, you have to remember that not everything can be stated out as fact and accepted universally. What is a fact for me may not be a fact for you, maybe a myth for you. What is a fact for you may be a myth for me, right? There is a difference. What I believe, what I very strongly believe in, may be absolute rubbish for someone else. We have to remember that. So there cannot be a sense of absolutism possible anywhere. You have to agree to disagree wherever you go. Not all whites are good people. Not all blacks are black people. Bad people, right? Not all men are bad. Neither are all women bad, right? We all have mixture of things, so there is no absolute. No, not all children are innocent, not all adults or grown-ups are mature and wise, right? Not all old people are wise. See, just because you grow a beard and have white hair on your head, it does not make you a wise man, right? You see, these absolutes you need to disagree with. You should not take for granted. Okay, taking for granted as in you blindly accept these things as facts, which may not be the case. Dogmatism as in principles, rules. Not all rules are worth following. You need to be, your conscience need to govern those rules. All right, conscience need to govern those principles. Just because some dogma is stated off by a certain saint, you should not blindly follow it. I mean, that's what that's what we happens most of the time, right? So you have to have an open mind. You have to come out of your provincialism. You have to come out of this this subjectivism, either personal or historical. This will hinder any real estimate of a poem, or real estimate of poem can be achieved only when you can rid yourself of these hindrances. Now, as far as flaws in Arnold's criticism is concerned, first of all, he had very low opinion of his contemporaries. He was didactic. While his high seriousness earned the churchyard epithet, his idea of great poetry fell short of touchstone with his narrow range. See, he was didactic, first of all. So didacticism is not acceptable all the time. You cannot see, when we are extremely preachy as in when we give too much of advice. Nobody likes to be advised a lot, right? So his didacticism is sometimes very off-putting as in it sort of irritates, annoys people sometimes. And while his high seriousness earned the churchyard epithet, his idea, as in like he wanted poetry to have a certain seriousness, right? So this his idea of poetry is rather churchy. Churchy isn't something that is extremely religious. It's like in a not very good sense. His idea of great poetry fell short of touchstone with its narrow range, mainly because, see, to him, any new poetry should prove itself to the standards he set. That is, it should be up to or similar to the kind of writing Dante or Shakespeare or Milton wrote, which is not possible. They wrote in a different age, and the requirements of that age were different. The language of that age used, the language used by that age was different. Even the syntax has changed so much from those times. So obviously the writings of this time is going bound to be different from the writings of those times. So touchstone, sort of, even though it's a very interesting concept, it could not be followed because of the very narrow range it left for criticism. um, as far as his practical criticism is concerned, he arranged English poets into major and minor categories. So he had this idea of who the major poets of his time and the earlier times were, and he had a separate category for minor writers. Okay. His real estimate and touchstone method of criticism were the precursor of the later practical criticism. So his ideas, though they are extremely narrow in range, they still had a great deal of influence. They still had a great deal of like hold over the kind of criticism that was taken up later on in various schools of criticism, okay, various schools of critics. His literary criticism, it ought to be descriptive. According to him, literary criticism ought to be descriptive and interpretative. You cannot just blindly state a word and leave it at that. You cannot be vague, you cannot be abstract. To him, it ought to be descriptive and interpretative. And according to Rene Belleck, Arnold's defense of the critical spirit, his theory of criticism, were a great contribution to English literary criticism. See, we have to agree with this, that Arnold sort of put a stamp on criticism, because his idea that criticism actually served a purpose, served a function, was not suggested of by any other critic before him. So really hats off to Matthew Arnold for bringing English literary criticism to the mainstream. Okay, so to conclude, despite his many faults, his moralistic approach, Arnold's ideas had widespread recognition and influence. By investing power to the critic for creating epochs in creativity, Arnold brought literary criticism to the forefront like no one else ever had. As I said earlier, no one had ever given or accorded criticism this kind of mainstream what do you call it, had never given it this kind of epoch creating power. No one had accorded criticism this kind of importance or relevance at all before him. So of course we will continue with T.S. Eliot, who saw criticism a little differently from what Arnold did, and his writing, his criticism is of an entirely separate stream, a different stream. So we'll go towards it, inshallah, in our next class. This is all for now. Thank you so much for your patient listening. Jazakallahu khair. Assalamu alaikum.